All right. Hey, friends, welcome back to Mike's podcast. I am so glad to have you joining us today and really grateful for the guests that we get to have on today. And my friend and I, we both have something in common, and that's that we both have held, and he's currently holding the same position at the same church. And so I was lead pastor at a church in Long Beach called Parkcrest Christian Church, and Jared is now the lead pastor at Parkcrest Christian Church. And so, welcome, Jared. Glad to have you here.
So glad to be here, man. Thanks. Great to hang out today.
So, I know some of the people listening to this will know who you are because
hmm
they know me through Parkcrest, but then there's a whole bunch of people who don't know who you are. So, could you just give us a little bit of your background? Give us some of your context.
Yeah, cool. Hey, like you said, my name is Jared. I actually have lived in 5 different states now, California, but was born in Connecticut, raised in the great state of North Carolina. If you guys ever been there, you know it's great. If you haven't, you need to go check it out sometime. I have now been in pastoral ministry for like 15 years, 16 years. I am married to a woman I don't deserve. She's amazing. Her name
That's
is
a true
Shauna.
story.
And we've been married for 12 years this year. We have 4 amazing children, McKenna, Declan, and Zoe and Naomi, all 10 and under. So our house is pretty fun. Like I said, lived in a few states. North Carolina, was in Oklahoma as well as Illinois, and now on the West Coast. And so it is, I will say this is the best weather that I've ever experienced ever in life. And
Yeah.
hopefully it can stay like that for a while.
It's good. Oh, well, I'm so glad to have you living out here on the West Coast and really grateful for you to be leading a church that I care so much about and have cared about
Mm-hmm.
for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about this the other day, and it's a part of why, even like you and I are having this conversation today, is Parkcrest is a little bit of an older church. It was
Mm-hmm.
started in the 1950s, and you're the eighth pastor of Parkcrest since then, and 7 of those pastors have been
Mm-hmm.
white men, and
Mm-hmm.
you are the first Black pastor
Yeah.
of that church. And I'm kinda curious, and I've never asked you this before, I'm curious,
Mm-hmm.
what does it feel like to step into that leadership role as the first Black pastor of a church that has always been led by white men?
It's actually just another stop in the journey. It's something I'm always aware of because a lot of the times in the spaces that I've been the first Black or the second.
Hmm,
Going back to even college, I was elected vice president of my college, and I was the 4th Black vice president in the school's history. So
wow.
it's just just different phases, and I understand. Like it just dawned on me, right? You said in 1950, like there's no way in the world I could have been pastoring this church in 1950.
Right.
And so I think for me, it is a perspective, but in the world that we're shaped in, like being an African American, I have to learn to live in a white world. And so I think for me, it's not anything that is stifling or that I'm pausing about, but it's just another step in the journey, like from doing it from vice president, being one of the first, African Americans to serve at my congressman's office when I was in a first job out of college, being on a couple different staffs where I was the first or second Black person. That's kind of the lot that God has given to me in my life. And so this is just another step of the journey. Obviously, there's a different weight coming with a lead pastor than I am just an associate or teaching. But
Sure.
man, it's an honor, and because frankly, like I said, living in different states, living in different places, I have had the opportunity to bounce between different worlds. And so now to be able to lead in a space where we can hopefully create a world that I want my kids to live in a church like that, then this is an honor. It's a privilege. Excited. Comes with its challenges too, but it's where
Yeah.
we're here, man.
I mean, I'm kinda curious, what would I 'cause, as you're saying, like, you've been the first in a lot of situations. I was trying to think of, like, where would that be true for
Mm,
me? And, um, I'm sure that there's probably some experiences I've had. I'm struggling to come up with one off the top of my head. What is something about being the first in a situation like that, in whatever kind of situation, whether leading the church or whatever, being the first or one of the first, what is something about that that I might not be aware of? Like, w
well, one. So here's one of the hard things. I think being the first is that sometimes every other single person who has an opportunity will be based upon my success or failure.
Oh my gosh.
whether it's intentional or unintentional. Like literally, I remember being in one space where we were talking about how there weren't a lot of people in color in leadership, and one of the pushback, and I put that in air quotes, was that, well, if one doesn't do well, it's going to mess it up for the rest. And I'm like, that's not true with anybody else. Like, so help me understand. I think that's just something that you like. There is an implicit bias, I think, that comes with that, or that we are judged on a harsher and a larger scale. Meaning that if Jared can't do it, does that prohibit another person of color from being a pastor here later? And so I think that's a weight, that I've kind of learned to carry. It's heavy and it's not fair, but it's kind of what it is. So I think that's probably just, if you haven't been the first or the only, that's just something that, like, yeah, all eyes are on me, whether it's successful or failure, and who's determining what success or failure is too as well. It's tough, but I think just knowing that and carrying that weight, if you haven't done that.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of, while I was at Parkcrest, we, shifted to become egalitarian and have women in all roles and
Mm-hmm.
leadership in the church,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember similar kinds of conversations with some of our first women elders,
Yeah.
our first woman teaching pastor, and, not realizing, like, the sort of weight,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that sort of comes with that.
Yeah.
Where I felt like, look, I'm helping to be a part of a community that's creating new spaces,
Mm-hmm.
which on one hand, I think is good and right,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
but I didn't have any kind of grasp as to the
Mm-hmm.
weight of what that meant for the first people stepping into those spaces.
Well, there's a lot of even theory behind like HR and hiring and stuff. Like the
Okay.
difficulty is if you bring someone on, like whether they're a person of color, minority, a woman, and they're the first. Oftentimes, if they're the first and the only one in there, they fizzle out because the systems aren't set up for them to succeed. So HR, what sometimes they're doing is they're doing something called cluster hiring, where they'll hire 3 or 4 who can journey together in this. So there's
Yeah.
somebody who can lean on. So like if I have a thought in my head and somebody like, oh, I'm not going crazy, you're also thinking the same thing. Oh, you saw that too as well. And when somebody's all on their own, it's hard. And I think the success rate could be a lot lower when you start talking about doing it long term in organizations and whatnot. So
That's really good. That's really fascinating. We could probably talk a long time about that,
we
but that's
could.
not what we got together to talk about.
No, no, no.
You and I connected last week as we were recognizing just the weight of what was happening across
Hmm.
America, as we were seeing the profile being raised of the way that Black people are being treated, as we saw murders being perpetuated that were ridiculous and unjust and horrific. And even in the last week since you and I talked, that there's been a super heightened sense of all of this now with protests and with riots and looting and with even like super people who I would consider not normally engaged in caring about this stuff,
Mm,
seemingly at least on social media caring about this stuff. So when you and I first talked last week, we were talking about seeing Ahmaud Arbery as a sort of like, maybe you could say like his murder as the thing that seemed to like catalyze a lot of
mhm,
people caring who didn't care before.
mhm.
And so I'm curious, one, if like even with another week of reflection, if you'd still see that as the case, and if so, like why do you think things began to change with what happened with Ahmaud Arbery?
And that's a fascinating question, and I think one that we can delve into. Now, I can say this: I'm not speaking for all Black people. I'm gonna say
Sure.
that, but just from my observation, I think there. I have this theory that when pain touches us, then we can actually identify with it easier than if it touches somebody who's far away or that we can't identify with. Like
Okay.
when we look at Ahmaud Arbery, one thing, he was doing something that a lot of people do normally and don't think twice about. He was out for a jog. Like how many of your listeners or whatnot, will probably either jog or walk or something, and they don't have to worry about anything happening to them. So I think that was the first factor, that he was. It wasn't like he was involved in stealing, or how the normal narrative goes. Like it's,
Yeah.
well, let's wait till all the facts come out. There was no extra facts that needed to happen in there because this was caught on video, and so you're seeing it's like, well, he's doing something I normally do. The second thing I think is this: is he fit the profile of a comfortable person of color. Now, what do I
Mm,
mean by that? Is
yeah,
that we all have people that we like and that we don't like and that we think are shady by the way they look. It's an implicit bias that we all have, and it's being aware of it, I think, which is more important. But being able to kind of speak against that, like when I saw Ahmaud Arbery's like high school graduation photo, like it looked like mine.
hmm,
And I was like, okay, no. So he looked safe. He was a handsome guy. He was an athlete as well. So like we can identify with people of color who are athletes as well too. So I think
yeah,
all those put into things like he's doing something that I would have done normally. He looks like a person that I would hang out with and like. He's an athlete. I like athletes. They're cool. So there's this internal thing that like that shouldn't have happened to him. Like uh, he wasn't like getting caught on a drug bust or anything to that extent. So I think people could identify with this is not right. And the video was atrocious. Like, I mean, so I think with the video evidence on top of that, that was the thing that tipped it over in the scale of like this is not right. And I saw a lot of friends like name words like racism who I've seen who never would do that in the past, and to say that this is an injustice. Usually some of the folks who I saw say that now would say, hey, let's wait for all the facts to come out. But for some reason, I think because they could identify, they may have had a friend who looked like Ahmaud Arbery, who they could identify with. And what if this happened to their friend? What if this happened to somebody they know? So I really think when pain touches us, man, we respond differently than it's with pain just is over there, farther away. So.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense to me. I even noticed how, and you and I had talked about this, that Andy Stanley, who's a prominent
Mm-hmm.
white pastor,
Mm-hmm.
and it's especially well known amongst like white pastors. Like
Yep.
he's somebody that a lot of us look to as somebody to provide leadership and voice. And he spoke out about it,
Yeah.
and it felt like when he spoke out about it, that that opened up the ability for others to feel the freedom to speak out about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I'd agree.
yeah, what I mean, we don't know, we're not talking to Andy right now, so what without, like we're obviously not talking to him, but what would you sort of say, like, maybe is behind some of that even?
So I think when your influencers say something, it gives you freedom to say something in a way that is different than if you are the one who take it. Because frankly, there could have been a lot of pastors who were afraid to say something because how is my congregation going to respond? How is
Mhm.
are they going to like what I say? But if Andy Stanley takes the bullet, like they can always point back and say, "Well, look, like Andy said it." With the most recent with George Floyd, the Southern Baptists like said something about it too. So I think there are these when your influencers or your folks who have the authority, who have the power, are able to lead the way, it does make it a little bit easier for everyone to talk about it. Now, is that right? No, but it is
Sure.
the world that we live in, and to recognize that. So with his voice, it's like, okay, he's saying something. All right, or it might even bring people who would never have said something if he said something to say, let me think about this. Maybe there's something I'm missing. It just opens the door for more conversation to move this down the field a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've really wrestled with over the last several years that this, like, kinda hits on is I've had a hard time owning space that I have influence in at, like
Mm.
I'm like, "Well, I'm just Mike, and I'm just Mike doing my thing."
Hmm.
And not always recognizing, like, no, there's actually a weight that
Hmm.
comes with when I do my thing.
Yep.
And we all, like, every one of us has that at some level, whether even if
Hmm.
it's like just in our family unit,
Hmm.
or if it's in like we have a larger online following, or if we have a congregation, or we have whatever, we've got some group of people who like trust us in some kind of way.
Hmm.
And there is this like responsibility with owning that, it seems.
Hmm. There is, and I think the those to whom much is given, much is required. Those folks who have that level of influence. I think you have to be careful with what you say because people will follow what you say. But then
Right.
if they're like, and that's why I love, like I said, I've met Andy one time. It was randomly at a conference. Really nice guy. We connected. 'Cause I think we both lived in North Carolina or something to that extent. But when he says it moves pastors to think about it differently. If I said it, it would be easier to Jared's just, well, of course that matters to Jared, or or whatnot. But when he says it, there's a different level of influence that that I just recognize that comes. It's not that he knows more about the subject matter or knows about the
Right.
details or even how to do the work, but the fact of simply saying it, it opens the door for folks who do know how to do this work to move it forward in a way, because now people are open to it.
Hmm. Um, so for you, as these things began coming out, as we heard about Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Christian Cooper, as all of that was sort of coming out, like what happened in you as these things were happening? What happened in you as you would wake up and read the news or see the tweets or whatever? What was going on in you?
Man, I wish I had a better answer, but really not much, because this is just normal.
Huh.
Like, I wish I could say, man, I was awoken and enraged, but no, like it's Tuesday. Like, it got more national, in terms of like when
Mhm,
Trayvon Martin back in 2012. Like,
mhm,
so for me, it's like this is just part of the narrative. It's part of something I'm very aware of. When you talk about relationships between police and people of color, and I'm saying this like, and my father-in-law is a 20-year veteran of the NYPD,
mhm.
so I understand like the work. My wife used to work for a police department as well too, and I know that there are some challenges and complications when you look at the data and statistics of policing and all that kind of good stuff. But so to me, none of it's surprising. Like I remember like when I was growing up, and this is a personal story, and like keep this on. I remember whenever I would have any kind of disagreement or altercation with a person in the majority culture, the first thing that the person would cut towards is, "Oh, you're an N word," like literally. And these are friends. Like in eighth
Really?
grade, I remember like, and eighth graders are going to argue all the time. Like I
Yeah.
got in a small argument with a guy, and he called me the N word. I'm like, but we're friends. We ate lunch together. So like this kind of like hostility just becomes a normal tension that you experience, whether it's overtly, where you have the individual, you have a whole systematic thing that I don't know if we'll get into today, but you have the individual part, but then there's this systemic thing that's going behind, and it's none of it. Like I really wish I could say I was surprised, but it's like it's just what it is, and what I'm thankful for is that these situations have had more people ask questions like maybe there is something behind what we're seeing. And will everybody? No, not everybody won't, and I'm okay with that. But I think there are individuals who are going to start asking questions. I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've had, since then, from people who I normally wouldn't have, like
Yeah.
near and far, and it's been beautiful and exhausting and beautiful at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what does it feel like to you? Several of my friends who are people of color have expressed to me that they're like, I'm glad you guys all finally, like, woke up to this." Um, and I've been, like, dealing with it for a long time, and
Mhm.
now everybody over the last 2 weeks wants to talk to me about it,
Yeah.
and I'm really tired of talking about it.
Yeah. No, that's true. Like, it's hard because, and it's people who mean very well, but when you
Yeah.
have 20 or 30 or 40 people ask you the same question, it's like, like how do you navigate that well? So I think, uh, you have to figure out what lane you're gonna do and what's appropriate. So for me, like I do look at it differently. Some of my friends, like some of my friends are like, man, I'm exhausted. I can't do it. Hey, here's a book list. Read that, and then we can have a
Mhm.
conversation. And I think it's appropriate. Like I do think it's appropriate. I think for my seat, like as a pastor, as a shepherd, where Jesus calls us to come towards, like, like he will leave the 99 and go to the one. Like I am, how do I lead a congregation through things like this as a part of our discipleship, keeping this thing rooted in scripture and what that means. So I will like probably put more energy in than some of my friends. Also, I'm coming in as a pastor. I have my other good friends who are coming in as prophets, and they're like, tear the system
Yeah.
down. And like you need those prophets. Like pastors need prophets. We need all of those things to come together to really to do this well. But it is exhausting, I know, to some of my friends, because it's like, hey, you got to do something before you come. Here's a book. Here's a movie to watch. Here's something, and then we can have a conversation. Because I think oftentimes the way it comes across, and it's not intentional, is, hey, can you teach me about this? And it's like,
Yes.
I can't. Like I don't have the energy to teach you about everything. But let's have a starting point. So
Yeah. So I'm curious, even one of the conversations that I've had a few times over the last week or so is we've read a lot of things as people are reaching out to their friends who are people of color and are checking in and what
Mhm,
so we're hearing on one hand like make sure you're checking in with your friends who are people of color, like make
mhm.
sure that like you're expressing that you care about them. And then we're also hearing like don't say I'm sorry, and you're like crap, I said I'm sorry to them. And then we're hearing like don't ask how they're feeling. They're tired of having to answer how I'm feeling. Like, crap, I sent Jared a message yesterday and said, like, "How are you feeling today?" And it feels really difficult to figure out, like, and I think one of the things that I hear from some of my white friends is they feel scared to say the wrong
Mm,
thing,
mhm,
or to do the wrong thing, and so they end up being silent and not
okay.
doing anything or saying anything, and not knowing like I don't know what the question is as much as like can you speak into that a little bit, asking you as the black man to provide another answer to me.
That's a good question. I think the first thing is like really check the relationship you have with that person.
Yeah.
Like if it's a person you haven't reached out to in a year and a half, like don't just thought about you. Like that's weird. Like, but if you actually have a relationship and you're actually doing life with this person, like there are buckets of grace available for that. That I think we all carry. And because yeah, I have gotten the text where there are folks I haven't talked to in a long time. Like, oh, okay, I can't, I don't have the energy. But there's some
Yeah.
like folks who I like. We talk weekly anyway, and they're like, I just wanted to check in on you. To me, that's just a normal part of the conversation. Like even I had a good friend, he texted me this morning. He was like, "Man, how is Pastor Jared? How is Father Jared? How is Jared?" And but we
Mm,
talk regularly, so it
yeah.
doesn't seem anything out of the ordinary. So I think the push on that would be what are the circle of relationships that you have? Do you have people of color who are in your life normally that you can check in on, that you know and love and it's not weird? Because
Hmm.
somebody that I really love and know, yes, they're gonna mess up with the way they ask, and I'm like, it's fine. Like we talk all the time anyway. And so I think it's now if you don't have those, then I think that makes the work a little bit harder. So you're not texting your friend from high school from 25 years ago and say, "Hey, just wanted to check in on you."
I don't know any black people, but I remember you
That's it. That's it. And so
for
it's
sure.
the circle relationships that we have. If they were mono ethnic before, they're probably still mono ethnic now. And so you
Hmm.
have to reach out a little more intentionally, and it might be weird in the beginning. But if you feel the need to do it, then I would encourage to do it and make it weird. And yes, you'll mess up. Yes, you'll say the wrong thing. Yes, you may even offend somebody, but don't let that stop you from moving towards someone.
That's really good. Um, well, so you talked about the difference between being a pastor and being a prophet. I heard
Mm.
somebody once describe it this way. They said, we need people to like shake the trees and get all the
Mm.
apples off the trees. And that's kind of the prophet. They come in and they just mess
Mm.
everything up
Mhm.
and rile everybody up. And then they leave the apples on the ground and they take off and go do something
Mhm.
else. And then the pastors are the people or the fruit. And the pastors are the people who take the fruit and like make the jam, who
Yeah,
have to like
that's a good
do the
analogy.
work with the stuff that's there.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the works of the pastor is to create a context to bring about the formation of people, to see
Mm.
people discipled into more and more Christ likeness.
Mhm.
Um, how do people need to be formed? What does formation look like in this space? How does this inform even how we think about formation?
That's so good. That's such a good question. One, I think we have to recognize that we are being formed regardless of whether we know it or not. There
Mm,
are
yeah.
habits, there are communities, there are things that we're reading, there are news outlets we listen to. Everything that we're doing is forming us, whether we like it or not. So, I just preached last week a sermon on Peter, where he, in Acts chapter 10, where he's at first refusing the Gentiles, like, that's unclean. Like, God, well, I've never done that before. And so, you had this idea to where for some reason he was formed in a way that he believed the Gentiles were unworthy, that they were unclean, that he shouldn't go near them until he gets into proximity with them and sees the Holy Spirit moving among them. And then he gets to this point where he's like, oh, now I see God as no respecter of person. And the part where I'm challenging that is like, I'm like, yo, you walk with Jesus for like 3 years and you saw him going to people that that people called unclean. They actually called Jesus a drunk and all that because he was, and you still didn't see that for real, Peter. But that's the power of formation. Like, I don't even think we see our own blindness in the moments, because it's just like, I don't know who made this quote up, but it's like, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish, because the fish lives in it. Like, these
Hmm.
environments that are shaped by the neighborhoods that we live in, the friends that we have, the news outlets that we choose to, that is discipling us, and to look at things a certain way. And so when people see something like a Black Lives Matter, there are two different responses that are based on the formation, and that's actually like a part of the discipleship of our own hearts that's been happening, for decades. And just stop me. I'm gonna go a little bit into it, but stop me if it goes too
Yeah.
far.
No,
But
no,
like,
no, no. Go, go.
but like when you think of discipleship, like a lot of it is, it's not just I get this information and I think about it and now I live better. Like,
Right.
discipleship is, you get this content and information, yes, but it's also done relationally, because we don't think rationally all the time. We do act on what are we feeling, what are we doing. And so if there's something that challenges us, like Peter was challenged with a thought, hey, maybe I can eat this food because it's clean, but it wasn't until he became in proximity with others that he actually made the turn to say yes. But then the crazy thing is, he actually turned back later when you read Galatians.
Yeah,
So
which is a fascinating deal,
it's,
right?
yes, it's the power
That
of formation.
it's like his eyes are opened to this
Mhm.
reality, and then
Yes.
something happens,
Mhm.
maybe the community that he is
Yes.
around a lot,
Mhm.
that ends up shifting him in a way where the realization that he had, he's now being called out by Paul, that like, why
Yep.
aren't you eating at this table any
Yep.
longer?
What is this? I think it's 2:14 Galatians, but it's like, until those from James came and the other
Yeah.
circumcised. So it's that community is a strong part of our discipleship. And so no matter how many facts or figures someone gives you, if there is no relationship that you have in your life that's actually challenging you, we're not going to change or move forward. And so,
Hmm.
like, how deep that goes is, and this goes into, all right, we're here a little bit now. This goes into a
Yeah.
little bit of some systemic stuff. Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
when we look at our neighborhoods, like, so look at neighborhoods or whatnot. For the most part, neighborhoods are homogenous in culture, and that goes back to everything from redlining to not allowing people. Even here in Long Beach, where we are right
Wait,
now.
talk about redlining for a minute.
Oh yeah,
What's
so cool.
redlining?
So redlining is basically, if you were going to purchase a home, banks would not issue loans to certain neighborhoods, and that's where the neighborhoods were people of color, and so therefore people of color could not. And this goes back to the 50s, 40s, 50s, even
Yeah.
before that. We could not own homes, therefore that inhibited our ability to get equity in our homes, to gain wealth, to be able to pass assets down from generation to generation. Like, I've said this before, but like, I was born in 1982, and I was the first. My brother's born in 1980. We were the first people who were born with all of our rights. Like,
Oh
that
my
is
gosh.
like, and so we're not even talking about slavery right now. Like, we're
Right.
talking about, I'm 38. My brother turns
That
40
blows
in a
my
couple months.
mind.
And so, like, another, like, and so when you think about redlining, it prohibits people from being able to get into certain neighborhoods. And we all know that neighborhoods, based on where you live at, allows the kind of school that you go to. And if
Right.
the neighborhoods are then, if the school is resourced by the property taxes that are in that area, then what happens is, oh, why is that school a good school and a bad school, even though they're only 2 or 3 miles apart? It's because the inequity that has happened that allowed these neighborhoods to go the way they are. And so, like, that is a part of formation, because look, when we talk about, hey, let's just hang out with people in our neighborhood. Well, who's really in your neighborhood? Let's
Right.
hang out with people that we know. And even this is some of my challenges with churches. Like, hey, we're going to be a church in the neighborhood. What does the neighborhood actually look like, or whatnot? So I think that, like, all those are challenges that you
Hmm.
think through, and it's all a part of the discipleship process, because we can hear this great sermon on a weekend, or this great thought, or read this great author, but if we go back to a homogenous culture, we end up being like Peter, and the relationships are going to shape us more than what God's invitation is shaping us to be.
That's really good. I was thinking about this the other day. I had this realization several years ago where especially when I started engaging a lot more with women leaders in the church,
Hmm.
that I began to realize that all of the stuff that I was reading theologically
Hmm.
was all written by men.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so all of my like And even like being in men's groups and things like that, that I
Mhm,
was like, I was with people who are most like me in
mhm,
relationship and in
mhm,
deep, intimate relationship. And then
mhm,
the things that were sort of feeding the way and had always fed the way that I thought
mhm,
about faith and the church and all that
mhm,
were all written by men. And so I started realizing like, oh, I need to be reading some women.
mhm,
And there were some like great women scholars that I started
mhm,
discovering, some great women authors I started discovering. Then I began to realize like my next sort of shift was this realization that, oh, I have a sort of church tribe that I have been reading out
mm,
of. And I have not at all been shaped by, like, say, the Eastern Church. I've been very shaped by the
mm.
Western Church, but the Eastern Church has a really
Google
rich
cough. Go
tradition.
ahead.
What's that?
Google cough. He's a Eastern Orthodox
Yeah.
theologian.
Yes, there's so
Really
much
good.
like, there's so much great in Eastern Orthodoxy,
Yep.
and there's so much great being written by people outside of, Protestant Western
Yeah.
evangelicalism,
Mhm,
and so began, like, reading and delving into all of them, realizing, like, I could expand out of that, and then I don't know why this was the last one, but it was. The last one was realizing, like, "Oh, I'm not reading many and engaging in this sort of work with, people of color."
mhm,
And I need to be reading more Howard Thurman and Willie
mhm,
Jennings
mhm.
and James
I had
Cone.
I had Willie Jennings. He was one of my professors. He's
Shut
amazing.
up.
He's
I have his
he's
commentary on Acts coming to the house right now.
what you're saying is so powerful because here's what it is like it's coming to the realization that we are not the owners of God's story.
Huh, okay.
We are
Unpack that a
not.
little bit.
So I think we come with our own set of beliefs and biases, good and bad, that when we read a scripture, we look at it through our lenses. So this played out real time for me when I was working at a different church in North Carolina. Is we were going through the entire Bible in a year, and one of the things that came up is when we got to the Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that, Joshua, like the war. Like the pastor stood up and said, he's like, man, like he's like, I know we're going to get through some of these harder texts, like the war, and we're going to see a lot of killing and blood. And that might be hard for us to justify because we know that God is a God of love. And like in that moment, I was like, huh. And then so I stood up and said something like in a way I was like, well, I was like, let me just bring it up. Like I grew up in the African American church. All you guys knew that we love the story of the Exodus.
Yeah.
We love the story of Joshua. And here's why, because when you are in a people group that is in the margins, you want a God that is going to right that. Like the only people who want Jericho walls to stay up are the folks who live inside of Jericho. But Israel wanted a God who will move in their behalf. So I was like, those stories were stories of comfort that probably played back from when there was, in the times of slavery, and the stories were passed forward. Like there's a lot of mimicking when you look at American slavery and then the children of Israel in terms of
Okay.
just like this crying out and this calling. And that's like, that was the view of the scripture. So God wasn't just a God of love. Yes, God was a God of love, and God was also a God of justice, who will move on behalf of God's people. And so I think that like but I was raised in that. And so it makes sense for me to look at it that way. If I wasn't raised in a context or were in proximity with individuals who were thinking that way, then I could see how, okay, that text makes me uncomfortable because now it's pressing against my formation. And then once it presses against you, who do you go to? Do you go to somebody who might be able to press you a little bit more, or do you go to the crowd of James and then you retreat
Huh.
back to your safety? Like it's
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you that you messed with me when you told me that when early on when we were having conversations and I
Mhm,
asked you about how you handled the violent Old Testament texts.
mhm,
Because for me, I
mhm,
had done years of work to
mhm,
like deal with it because
mhm,
it had been messing with me for a
mhm,
long time. And
mhm.
I had come to some places that I felt good with. And then you said that, and I was like, I don't think what I was about to say something that would put it put us in the explicit category
Let's
on
go.
iTunes.
Beep.
But I
We'll
was like,
just do that.
yeah, like, "Darn it, Jared, like, why you gotta mess with me with that?"
But
Um,
it's a part of the story, and I think that's the beauty, I think, of perspectives, because we each come with our own lens. We do, and I think owning that is the first thing, but then recognizing where can it be filtered in a way that I can see a bigger picture of who God is.
yeah, and I think one of the things I think that I've been discovering is that I only can be aware of what my lens is when I'm coming into contact with people
Yes.
who have a different lens.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so
Yes.
if I am around people who are most like me, if I'm
Mhm.
in the echo chamber on the internet, if I'm watching news that just confirms, sort of like
Mhm.
makes me feel good and riles me
Mhm.
up and whatever, then I have no awareness of what lens I actually have. I think that I
Mhm.
do, but I actually don't
No.
until I'm being confronted, until
Mhm.
I'm like, "What do you do with these Old Testament violent texts?" As this way to like get you to tell me about your hermeneutics, and you're like, "Here's what I do with it," and I'm like, "Ah, dang,
What you said, and it all goes back to the relationships that we have, because it's you know, and you just mentioned it, echo chambers and confirmation bias. Like, we
yeah,
will look for things that we can agree with naturally. I do it, you do it, every person listening, you do it whether you know it or not.
yeah,
And that's on either side of the aisle. So this is not a conservative thing or a liberal thing. It's a thing. It's a people thing. Like, we look to confirm what we believe, and are there voices in our life that we invite that could potentially press against that in a healthy way? Like,
yeah,
have you considered this perspective? And it's like, oh, I never thought of that. It doesn't mean you have to change your mind or change anything, but I think the invitation to see something in a bigger way, that it's like, oh, now I see God is no respecter of person.
hmm,
Like, so, but keep in mind, even so, the other problem, I'm getting back to the text and I'm getting mad. My other problem with that, now I see God is no respecter of person, is because even when you look at the Exodus, there was a mixed multitude that left Egypt. It just wasn't all of Israel. It was also anybody else who went. So it's like, God's been doing that since
uh,
the beginning. Like,
yeah,
Peter, you
yeah,
should have studied that when you memorized Torah as a young man. Like, you should have. So it's yes. Sorry, I can
yeah.
get crunk about stuff like that.
No, I love it. I love it. I love it so much. I'm really grateful for you bringing all that stuff up. So, so Jared, the reality
Mhm,
is like, for white people like me who
mhm,
are like, hey, we're beginning to recognize that there's something
mhm,
going on here. We're beginning to recognize not only is there something going on in our country, but we're even beginning
mhm,
to recognize like this is a necessary part of my formation is
mhm,
entering into these sorts of spaces, and I want to become who God designed and created me to become. I want to move more
mhm,
and more towards Christ likeness. Um, and so we need to do some of our own work
mhm.
to begin moving in that direction. Do you have maybe we could talk about a couple of ways, like how does this become practical? What does this start to
Yeah,
look like? What are just some like baby steps 101 sort of level things that
yeah,
we could be doing?
yeah. Well, the first thing is like awareness, and so if you are in a space where it's awareness, it's what do I then now begin to study? So, like, there are a couple of great resources out there. The book Divided by Faith is a good place to
So good.
start. Specifically, when you talk about the church, in terms of
Yes.
being the most divided time, 11 o'clock, it just gives a good history and a good perspective. So, like, if you're a primer, that's a really good one. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, actually, Just Mercy is another great book. And also, in the month of June, it's free. So if you have Amazon, you can actually rent it for free
I
digitally.
saw that, and
Yes.
which is wonderful in so many levels. I think Just Mercy, like, I just was weeping in the theater at
Mhm.
it, and we brought our kids to it, and so our kids at the
Mm.
time, they're 14 and 12, I think,
Mhm.
and, I was so glad to have them in there to be, for them to get an exposure to the reality of what's going on in the justice system,
Mhm.
and things that they would not experience if they
Mhm.
weren't being intentionally exposed to that as
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
experience.
And the beauty about Just Mercy too is, like, this was 1986, 87. Like, we're not talking about 1743.
Right,
Like, this is recent, and the Supreme Court case, at the end of it, without, spoiler alert, 2015. So this is like,
right.
I love the Just Mercy aspect because it is current. If you are able to read, more than likely you were alive. If you're listening, you're probably alive at that time. And so I think it's a good, powerful, it's a great movie, and it's an easy read. So I think just to kind of like, all right, that's a good first step. Like, I think another step, like, do you actually have people of color in your life that you are not afraid to ask the question towards?
Hmm.
Um, like and if you don't, like, don't feel bad. Like, so this isn't a beat over the head and I don't have any black friends.
Right.
Like, it's okay. It's okay to feel weird at this time because, like, I keep going back to Peter when he's like, now I see, like, his whole world fell apart. Like, so now some people are starting to see, oh man, maybe I was wrong. Like, maybe I didn't see it. Like, you're gonna go through guilt, shame, anger, denial, like the stages of grief you'll probably go through,
Yeah.
which is probably fine. If you feel heavy, it's probably some of that you're going through right now. But if you have a person of color that you can trust, after you've done some reading, like one of those two books, and then discuss that content.
Mhm.
Sometimes maybe it's not discussing how you feel, because even me, as that question is hard for me to answer. Even
Mhm.
for the folks that are there, because like I don't know what the person's looking for for me to answer sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, I feel, because all this stuff isn't new to me, I'm not as broken as some people who are just finding it out.
Yeah.
So see if you have that. But start with the book, start with the movie. Oh, 13th, another Netflix one.
Yeah.
Really good movie.
It's a
We're gonna start
documentary.
talking about the documentary about the prison industrial complex. That's a really good one as well too to start out with.
Yeah, that one was really, I felt like eye-opening for Allison and I when we first
Mm,
watched it, and um, opened up, like, other areas that I needed to, like, push into
mm,
more to understand more.
mm.
Yeah, I thought that was good.
That's good.
Um, if I could throw one out for my white friends as well, Latasha Morrison runs an organization called Be the
Be the
Bridge.
bridge. Hmm.
And, I got turned on to it because a friend of mine's on the board, and they have a program,
Mm,
called BTB 101, and
mm,
it's essentially a introductory program for before even, like, you start, like, trying to figure out, like, and understanding systemic racism and understanding all of that, that it's like, "Hey, there are some basic things, some internal work that, white folks that we need to do that we don't fully understand that will hinder us from being able to engage in work of racial reconciliation."
mm.
And so BTB 101 is sort of like their introductory course to, like, help you sort of, like, grapple with some of that stuff. So so I would recommend checking that out
Good.
as well.
That's good. No, it's I would say that the soft skill is give yourself the grace to mess up,
It's good.
because nobody's gonna do this right.
Yeah.
There is not a, hey, if you do these 5 things, then you'll be the perfect reconciler. Like, it's not there. So give yourself the grace to mess up in a conversation. You will probably say the wrong thing, and that's okay. And the beauty is, like, when there's a good relationship, then there's buckets of grace, that I think we all carry, but carry that bucket for yourself as well too. And I
That's
think
good.
that'll be helpful. And it's hard work. So I wish I could say, like, even look at it from a theological level. For us to be reconciled to God, it took a bloody cross, and that was hard. Um, for us to be reconciled to one another, it's gonna be hard, and it's gonna
Yeah.
be hurt. There's gonna be hard conversations. There'll be things you'll be offended. You'll offend others. But don't stop the work, especially if these past few moments, spoke something inside of your heart that you like. Don't stop the work because it gets hard. Um, keep going.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think it's really important for us to remember, like, we're wanting to do something today because
Yeah.
all of this stuff is super heightened. And what it seems that one of the things that's happening today is that we are getting exposed, we are having our eyes opened, and we're not going to fix it next week.
Mhm.
It
No, no, you're not. Like, I'll just give you I wrote this down, so I want to make sure that I say this right.
hmm,
But it was when it first started happening. A friend of mine just checked in on me and, like, how are you, uh, how are you doing, and okay, where I write it, you might oh, here it is. Here it is. Here it is. I said exhausted, and this is the reality. I said realizing I will not live long enough to see the fruit of racial reconciliation and justice.
Oh my gosh.
Disappointed, my kids probably won't see it. Hopeful that my grandkids may smell it, and believing my great grandkids will taste it. Because that like this
Will
is
you
a
say that again? Oops.
um, I said, so there's like, how are you? Just checking on you. I said, exhausted, realizing I will not live long enough to see the fruit of racial reconciliation and justice from a large scale. Disappointed, my kids probably won't see it. Hopeful that my grandkids may smell it, and believing my great grandkids will taste it.
Wow.
Like this is generational that will have to happen. And so yeah, so it's giving yourself grace to realize that like you won't be able to fix the problem overall. Like no one person can. It's but how do we raise children that will raise children that will raise children that create a different world for them to live in? And I
Wow.
think that perspective was humbling for me, and like, like this is work I wanted to commit myself to. But then recognizing it's just like, man, God has called me to just do this part of the journey. Like, the 4x4 races,
Mhm.
like I'm gonna carry the baton, and then eventually I'll pass it on to my children. And then hopefully they'll pass it on to their children, and then your children will pass it on to their children. And like that's the level of the work we're talking about. Because even when you look at, somebody, I was reading something, I think it was some president, maybe the YMCA. I don't recall his name, but he says like he was hurting and hopeful, but he said he was hurting because it felt like he says when he looked at the protest, he says it felt like 1968, and he
Mm.
had been so he's seen both. And so you're talking about over 40 years, close to 50 years, a little over 50 years, where it's been the same thing. So it's like it's not going to be just I fixed it and I did it. But no, it's how are we discipling and forming reconcilers who can then continue the work and form and create new reconcilers who then their children will be reconcilers. And then just maybe, like I said, 3 generations from now, there's a different world that they'll experience that I won't. And I'm okay with that. Like I'm okay with that.
Mm.
Um, but it's just a
That's really
perspective.
good. Oh
Mhm.
gosh, that's so both like I love your hope within that and
Mhm.
your realism within it is, if I'm honest, a little depressing.
Mhm.
Um, but I love the hope that gives the space to endure and to press in for the long
Yeah,
haul.
yeah. You gotta have hope. Like you have to have hope for something, which is I think the perspective actually gives me hope because it's something my dad always taught me. And I remember so my dad was a first generation college student, really smart. He went to Yale and Duke, like my dad's crazy smart. And I remember him saying like my great grandmother, which is his grandmother, the only job she was able to get was to mop floors. But I remember him saying that like I remember her praying over me while she mopped floors, that I won't experience the life that I know, but I'm praying that my grandchild will. And so it's
Mm,
just this whole generational connection that this world can be changed by our children and our children's children and our children's children. And that's the perspective that I'm going to carry the baton as far as I can, and then pass it off.
that's good. That's a really good word to leave us on here.
Yeah.
Jared, thank you so much for being with us. I really
Thank you,
appreciate
man. I
you.
appreciate it.
I'm grateful again to have you lead in a church that I love and care about. Grateful for you being here in Long Beach and
Mhm.
to be a significant voice and leader in our city for such a
Mm.
time as this. So
Thank you.
thanks for being here with me.
Thank you. Love you, Parkcrest, if you're listening.
All right. Grace and peace, friends.